You have a bureaucracy that seems to be stuck in a rut, a very deep one.
I think they've reached for whatever piece of environmental concern might be helpful to the cause.
I have characterized it in the past as being a tyranny, and a tyranny is a tough thing for us to deal with in this country.
I'd say it was a revolution that we all should embrace.
Mono Lake, an inland sea near the California-Nevada border. It was fed by mountain streams for 1 million years. But in 1941, the stream water was taken for urban use. Massive mineral formations were exposed as the lake began to dry up. Countless birds were put in jeopardy. In the 1970s, the fight began to save the nation's second oldest lake and its wildlife. Join me as I piece together the near legendary story, the battle to decide the fate of Mono Lake. I can't say I'm without bias, but after meeting so many dedicated people, I can respect all the players involved in this monumental issue. Mono Lake may be only 8 by 14 miles in size, but news of its plight is touching people's hearts worldwide.
Major funding for the battle for Mono Lake has been provided by the Michael J. Connell Foundation, the California Council for the Humanities, the Mono Lake Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional support has been received from these organizations.
I've always wanted to kayak in Mono Lake and explore the expansive blue waters I've seen only from a distance. The lake level was declining rapidly. Kayaking was a perfect way to see firsthand the environmental changes. My instructor was Gary Nelson. He runs boat tours for the local Mono Lake Committee. Gary insisted on an early start to avoid the treacherous afternoon winds. It was in 1941 that the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power began taking the fresh stream water that flows into Mono Lake. By 1982, the lake had fallen almost 50 feet. The rock formations around me were the first and most obvious sign that the lake was drying up. These natural sculptures, known as tufa towers, were formed underwater as springs reacted with chemicals in the lake. Today, they're a constant reminder of the lake's vulnerability. Mono Lake is located in a desert region near the mountains of Yosemite National Park. These high mountains supply the snow melt that has kept the lake alive for 1 million years or more. The High Sierra towers over 1 mile above the lake. Mono's waters lie in an ancient geologic basin created by vast earth movements colliding and sinking. Each spring, melting snow fills the alpine streams that wind their way down towards the lake. The cold water descends quickly through meadows and forests. But this natural flow is interrupted by very unnatural means. Before the streams reach Mono Lake, they run up against concrete dams constructed by the Department of Water and Power. Most of the water can be diverted to a city hundreds of miles away. What water remains continues down to Mono Lake. Here it mixes with the lake's naturally salty and alkaline water. You can't drink it, no fish can live in it. It is a chemical broth not duplicated anywhere else on Earth.
Mono Lake is a terminal lake, or a lake that's at the end of a drainage system. That is to say, water flows into the lake, but no water leaves. Only by evaporation can water leave the lake. So all the minerals that are dissolved in stream water gradually accumulate through time in the lake, and so it becomes more and more saline over time.
The water became even more concentrated after diversions began. Mono Lake is saltier than seawater and far more alkaline.
Mono Lake has a pH of about 10, which is about 100 to 1,000 times as alkaline as seawater is. So it's very severe chemical soup, primordial soup. If you have any cuts, you immediately know exactly where those are on your body, because this water is so alkaline that it actually will eat your tissue.
As unusual as the water itself are the tiny creatures that thrive in it. Brine shrimp are living fossils, genetically unique, and everywhere I went there were alkali flies. They gather along the shores and shallow parts of the lake, providing meals for millions of birds that nest here, or stop over to fuel themselves for their migratory travels. With everything from birds to scenic vistas, Mono Lake could have become a national park. But early on, it was overshadowed by nearby Yosemite. Even so, in 1862, an enthusiastic Mark Twain brought the lake to the attention of the American public. He was mesmerized by its stark beauty. He wrote about Mono Lake in a travel book called Roughing It. His great fascination was the water, so alkaline he could shampoo with it, or do his laundry. With a traveling companion, he rowed out to the lake's largest island, Pa'oa. Both men nearly drowned when a windstorm suddenly arose. Today, the trip to Pa'oa Island is somewhat safer. Scott Stein, a geologist, was my guide. The people who harvest the brine shrimp commercially ferried us to the island. Scott began researching the lake around 1979. Since then, he's become an expert in reconstructing the lake's changing levels and its volcanic history. We were now passing over the lake's deepest point, 160 feet to the bottom.
Yeah, I see that. Some of them are attached.
The water near the island was thick with brine shrimp and alkali flies in their various life stages. We landed in the vicinity of Mark Twain's close call with death more than a century ago. It was as if we were the first ones ever to set foot on the island.
Their farm, but they had some troughs up here where they were taking advantage of the water that would condense.
Vegetation was scarce. Lava formations were scattered everywhere.
They could keep the goats going that way.
As we talked, I saw that Scott's interest in the lake went beyond scientific fascination.
This tree. You see that that there's some destruction that's going on because of water diversions and whatnot, and I think it's inevitable that one's science is going to be brought to bear in one way or another on these kinds of problems.
Why did you come?
Well, the fascination.
Scott has contributed to a picture of what the lake was like before water diversions began in the 1940s.
Very, very dynamic. There were counts in the 1940s and the early 1950s that suggested that there were over 1 million ducks on the lake during the winter months.
Right.
And those now are gone. So one of the major impacts of the water diversions has been to make the lake more saline, no more fresh water on the lake. We've reduced the lake to where it's now at a level lower than the freshwater coves that these ducks used to congregate in. So we've lost basically 1 million ducks.
Scott's work has also shed light on the lake's volcanoes and the creation of Pa'oa 300 years ago.
Most of Pa'oha Island is composed of lake bottom sediments that were uparched when this volcanic material, when the magma intruded the sediments, and it lifted up the island, in a sense trapdoor-like. Here on the southeastern corner of the island where we are now, we can see the fumaroles and these the volcanic rocks protruding through here. Here's one of the areas, one of 2 or 3 areas where the volcanic material actually broke through those sediments. We've had, more than a dozen eruptions here in Mono Lake in the last 1,700 years. My sense is that we're overdue.
For me, Pa'oa Island was a perfect embodiment of Mono Lake's haunting, primeval landscape. The people who have known Mono Lake the longest are the Mono Paiute, a people called Kutzadika. The last of her people to collect the alkali flies is JESSIE DURANT. The fly pupa is the tribe's traditional food and is called kutsavi. As the lake declines, JESSIE finds kutsavi harder to gather.
I haven't been out here every year, but I think it's getting less and less all the time. This was our only food and that we survived on during the winter. And some winters we had real hard.
Lucy Parker comes from a nearby tribe to learn how to harvest kutsavi. JESSIE's prayer for the gathering of kutsavi is in Paiute.
Iwashugeshu manik yahukaru iwe kusabi.
For JESSIE, an ancient and bountiful food is at stake as the lake declines.
Mu asu, iwa kusabi. That means years ago we had a lot of it. The elders all lived on this and we all liked it, but the younger generation, Yahu, they put it the bekai pisapi. That means the younger generation, they're not used to it.
Lucy and JESSIE dry their harvest in the sun and move on looking for better collecting places. JESSIE's way of life is preserving an ancient culture that was forever changed by the ambitions of a distant and powerful city. In a bold move to acquire water, Los Angeles gained the support of President Theodore Roosevelt. With federal cooperation, a great aqueduct was completed in 1913. It took a workforce of 5,000 5 years, and the pipe stretched 200 miles across the desert. It was the most difficult and complex municipal project the nation had ever seen. The big aqueduct did not reach Mono Lake, but in 1930, the voters authorized an extension. Tunneling began in 1934. By 1940, the long steel pipe was in place, and the State Water Board gave its okay to divert the streams that filled the lake. With its dams in place, the city could intercept over 50% of the water that once made its way to the lake. At times, Los Angeles obtained a fifth of its water supply from the Mono region. The water poured into Los Angeles reservoirs. Mono Lake was all but forgotten. While the lake declined, the city grew on its newly acquired water. Few people in the Mono region protested the city's political clout. Andrea Lawrence, an elected supervisor for Mono County, has tried to understand why opposition was so partial and ineffective.
I think, frankly, there was, and it's historic. It's what happens to all our structures when they're in place a long time. There's the arrogance of power. It never occurred to the city of Los Angeles that they weren't entitled to, that they didn't have the right to, that this wasn't, in fact, their land. It is, in a taxpayer's sense, the land they bought, but all the other ancillary uses of this. Never occurred to them it wasn't theirs. It never occurred to them that they weren't entitled to do what they have historically done. I have characterized it in the past as being a tyranny, and a tyranny is a tough thing for us to deal with in this country. It's contrary to our way of operating or appreciating it even. To deprive an area of something essential as water is really a very serious, that's a serious crime against both nature and also the human beings that are attached to that area.
The lake may have lacked the defenders it deserved. For Andrea, the problem was a failure of nerve.
In a sense, they held you captive. I mean, you're held hostage to this larger machine. And it's intimidating. People were intimidated by it. They wouldn't stand up to this.
Andrea's view of history may be bleak, but there's something to be added. The effects of the early diversions did not go totally unmentioned. Eldon Vesto was a biologist specializing in fisheries. In 1939, he was assigned to Mono's lushly forested streams, used for fishing and other recreation. The outdoors was his love, and even today he recalls his alarm as the trees died when the water was taken.
The first to die were the
were the willows and the cottonwoods. I knew that eventually, unless there were some springs or some sustaining water, that this would be nothing but a gravelly, cobbly, dry wash all the way to Mono Lake. The loss of this would just be a disaster. It looked very ominous to me, and as time went on, it proved more and more ominous.
In 1941, Eldon saw his favorite stream, Rush Creek, drying up. He wrote the Department of Water and Power requesting that more water be allowed to flow. The request was denied. But as the streams and lake began to dry up, Eldon took notes on the changes. His notes would someday be a cornerstone of Mono Lake litigation. The water diversions continued through the 1940s and 50s. The lake level went down, but somewhat slowly. The department aqueduct simply didn't have the capacity to divert all the water. Then something unexpected began to accelerate events. Jim Wixer, on the department's water management team, recalls the state knocking at the door.
The state came to us and said, you know, we gave you this permit in 1940. You've not developed the water like you said you were going to. If you don't fully develop your rights, we're going to let somebody else come in and take those rights. So you're looking at a whole different era on values. You know, use that water. It's being wasted into a dead sea.
The department responded to the state's threat. By 1970, a second aqueduct was completed alongside the first. Now it was possible to carry 50% more water. That's when people noticed things were changing. Once submerged tufa towers lined the lake shores. Immense dust storms rose from the newly exposed lake bottom.
All the springs is dried up around the area where the used to be beautiful springs where there used to be a lot of ducks, hang out in, know, mallards.
Freshwater springs.
Freshwater springs.
Right.
They had a tough time.
Augie Hess is Paiute.
Right.
He remembers people being happy to get out as LA bought land and water rights.
Live here all winter long.
Did anybody put up opposition when
Not here, no. I think the farmers here wanted to sell out and get out of here. Yeah,
they did.
Sure.
But some of the Mono Paiute remained. They lived and hunted around Mono Lake. It was a way of life that kept them in contact with the streams and wetlands and springs in the region. The existence of the Mono Paiute was tied to the environment, and they saw land and wildlife suffer as water was withdrawn. I got together with Augie Hess and two brothers, Jerry and Raymond Andrews. Along with other Mono Paiute like Jesse Durant, they worked behind the scenes to alert people to what's happening at Mono Lake.
I think there's some that traded through here, probably.
Raymond Andrews hasn't been daunted by the complexity of the issues.
There's been a lot of change in the lake. There's been a lot of change in the plants and the animals that were abundant in the area. It's like people sit in Los Angeles and in their nice offices and don't know what they're doing on this end with the land and everything like that. They like coming up here and vacationing and doing all that stuff, but that's only for just a short time.
Despite a desire to be heard, tribal members have little hope of concerted action due to the government's refusal to grant them official standing.
Considering our status as being a non-federally recognized tribe, you can only do as much as you can. It's like you're an ex officio member of some big organization, and the only thing you have is a voice and you don't have a vote in anything.
After 1970, the second aqueduct allowed twice as much water to be taken. The lake was falling fast, 2 feet a year, and a total of almost 40 feet since 1941. Few voices protested until 1976, when a group of young scientists arrived. David and Sally Gaines were among them.
Wandering around Mono Lake's shores, I found a beauty there, an incredible sense of place that just really moved me. This seemed like a very, very special place, and a place that needed a voice, that somebody should speak out for.
There was a wonderful charged atmosphere and energy in these young people. Their intellects had been so trained through their schooling and education and their science, if you will, that they could look at this lake and this basin and see it through those eyes, but they were also seeing it through their hearts and their spirits.
David Gaines wasn't alone in his enthusiasm, but he did have a way of getting things going. He and others formed the Mono Lake Committee, began a newsletter, and started a public education campaign. It was a crusade to save Mono Lake.
From the beginning, we always felt that any solution to Mono Lake was going to be a compromise. I mean, City of LA definitely had good arguments of why they should continue taking the water. Their infrastructure was all there and built and paid for. There was no reason there wasn't enough to save Mono Lake and have water go to the city. And that was, to us, just a reasonable compromise. I mean, we weren't being wild-eyed fanatics.
Wild-eyed or not, David had an exceptional energy.
What drove David was his love for the lake. We knew how old Mono Lake was, almost 1 million years old, and then to think that it could be dried up within somebody's lifetime was just too heartbreaking.
David and Sally developed a conciliatory approach to LA. It was their trademark.
We're talking about sharing. We're talking about balance. What we will be left with, if diversions are not reduced, is an alkali wasteland, a sterile chemical sump where there is now one of the most beautiful and life-productive places on Earth.
In 1978, David and Sally moved to Mono Lake. The level was still falling, but it was the lake's noisiest creature which injected urgency into the issue. David Gaines and other researchers found that Mono Lake had the world's second largest colony of California gulls. The younger birds are colored brown, unlike the white and gray of the adults. In 1981, something unexpected happened to the young gulls. They died off. Not just a few, but thousands upon thousands. In his newsletter, David Gaines attributed the die-off to a lack of food. His guess was that the declining lake level had affected the brine shrimp. The department countered that the die-off was a fluke, with no provable cause. The gulls had launched the first of many scientific debates. Eventually, ornithologist David SHUFORD and others began conducting annual surveys of the gull population. The die-offs did not recur, but other threats were looming. Each spring, volunteers using spray cans mark nesting sites so that the gull survival rate can be measured. The work is tedious. "50,000 flying acrobats fill the sky." The nesting sites are vulnerable, yet Mono Lake has the ingredients for a successful breeding colony: isolated islands and a plentiful supply of food. The cause of the gull die-off of 1981 was never clear to Dave SHUFORD, but it was apparent that as the lake became lower, the islands used by the gulls would be connected to the mainland. This land bridge was the last thing SHUFORD wanted.
The land bridge will connect the islands to the mainland, and because gulls are ground nesting birds, they seek sheltered places to nest, and islands are the best because, aerial predators could potentially get to them, but their main predators would be coyotes, which can cross the land bridge very easily and get out to the islands, and they can disrupt the whole colony within a few days.
Gull nests are simply made, 2 or 3 eggs in a small depression. The chicks hatch in May and June, fluff balls with polka dot heads.
There's only certain areas that are suitable to the gulls. I mean, you need a lake that's highly productive for food, like Mono Lake is. You need one with good protected nesting islands, and you start looking around throughout the West. I mean, those sites do become limited at a certain point.
With the gulls so closely tied to the lake, they became familiar symbols of its plight. By 1982, David Gaines had spoken loudly enough to generate financial and legal support. Mono Lake advocates such as the Audubon Society and Friends of the Earth joined the committee and took Los Angeles to court. The city argued that its use of Mono water was legal and that its investment had to be protected. It hired attorney Adolph Moskowitz.
The Mono Lake Committee has its own agenda. As I see them, they have gone overboard.
Adolph Moskowitz launched an aggressive defense of Los Angeles. He based his argument on a cornerstone of the American way, private property.
We were concerned that water rights that we had been given, that were vested by use, that were licensed under California law, and that were supposed to be permanent, and were our property rights, were going to be taken away from us.
Moskowitz pointed to the city's investment in water. The system serviced 500 square miles, served 3.5 million people. The city's rights were untouchable. It was too late to tamper with the system.
There's such an investment of time, money, and such reliance by those who get the water on its continued delivery that it's important to have permanence and security in water entitlements.
Powerful arguments threaded their way through the courts. Both sides appealed to legal tradition. The Mono Lake defenders took a bold approach, asserting that the city's property rights in water were not untouchable, were not absolute. The argument was based on an ancient legal concept called the public trust.
What we've got in the public trust doctrine is a tool the judiciary and the water board can use to open up some of those old rights where it looks like a big mistake was made and there's serious environmental damage.
The United States incorporated the public trust doctrine into its laws, adopting it from older English common law, which in turn received the concept from ancient Rome. The public trust affirms that there are public rights in public waters and protects lakes, rivers, bays, and shorelines as part of the nation's common heritage. Mono Lake advocates argued that these rights could not be disregarded.
What we've got with the public trust doctrine is a new form of water right, a senior form of water right, an environmental water right for the benefit of the people as a whole.
The case was heard by the state Supreme Court. Justice Broussard would write the majority opinion.
These plaintiffs in the Mono Lake case came along and pointed to the doctrine and said to the court, we think it fits in the Mono Lake situation. And the court, in this amazingly important decision in 1983, agreed with them.
Justice Broussard wrote that Los Angeles had a justifiable interest in Mono waters, but this interest must acknowledge the public trust. Los Angeles could no longer ignore the needs of Mono Lake. The ruling stated that the public trust is an affirmation of the duty of the state to protect the people's common heritage of streams, lakes, marshes, and tidelands. It was a tribute to David and Sally Gaines and the Mono Lake defenders. It was a tribute to persistence. The Mono Lake decision became a milestone in legal history.
Most judicial opinions are pretty dreary reading, but once in a while, when they're dealing with a great issue, a court rises to a level of eloquence that's really memorable. And Justice Broussard's decision in the Mono Lake case, I think, is one of those rare occasions. Anyone can sit down and read that decision and understand that it was a kind of historic moment for public rights and for the development of environmental rights. It empowered environmental resources. It empowered the California gulls, one might say. It recognized the importance, the centrality of ecosystem protection to the future of the state and to the future of the planet.
The court's decision was reluctantly accepted by Adolf Moskowitz, at least for the time being.
I was very disappointed when the Supreme Court decision came out because I thought in terms of precedent, what the law was, that our position should have been sustained.
In point of fact, the lake was not saved. The ruling left the specifics to other courts and the State Water Board. The city continued to divert water from Mono streams. Within 2 years, the adversaries were back in court. The improving gull population delighted the Department of Water and Power. It insisted everything was fine.
I think when you're advocating a point, such as the Mono Lake Committee has done, they'll grasp for any issue that seems to help build their case. To a large degree, I think most scientists do believe that the system is doing quite well, is healthy, and is not on the brink of collapse.
In the winter of 1982-1983, the unexpected occurred. The High Sierra snowpack was 220% that of normal. Even the department's dams could not restrain the deluge. Water surged down the streams. Measurements indicated that the season was the wettest of the century. Years later, geologist Scott Stein will reveal the extent of the damage.
It's apparent from up here that we're standing on a very, very flat plain, a plain that was formed by the stream as it flowed toward Mono Lake over large amounts of time. And what has happened through time is that because the city of Los Angeles has lowered the lake, has caused the level of Mono Lake to fall, Rush Creek has incised its delta, giving us this big notch, this big declivity, this big canyon that we're standing in front of right now.
Old photos show that Rush Creek created a wetlands as it flowed into the lake. But in flood years, the stream cut deeply as it poured into a lowered lake. Rush Creek simply kept eroding the land around it. 500,000 cubic yards of soil washed into the lake.
This is one of the impacts that the city of Los Angeles has had on the lake and the surrounding landscape. This is probably the longest lasting of those impacts. Most of the impacts will be gone 25 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. This one is probably a 1,000 to 5,000 year scar here.
As Scott walked through the wind-blown snow, I could almost imagine the green marshes that once existed here. Scientific research at Mono Lake was in full swing by the 1980s. Scott Stein and hydrologist Peter Vorster designed various models to predict the lake's future. With continuing diversions, the lake would shrink to a chemical sump shortly after the year 2000. The trends were unmistakable. Aquatic biologist David Herbst was shedding light on the lake's food web. Along with David Gaines, he had been one of the early researchers.
It was a point in my life where I really found something that truly fascinated me and challenged me, and I was unable thereafter to leave Mono Lake. I kept coming back.
With associate Gail Dana, he exposed brine shrimp and flies to the high salt concentrations of a shrinking lake.
What we see in Mono Lake is that there's a gradual inhibition of growth and reproduction, body size of flies and shrimp as the salinity of the lake gets higher. And ultimately, if the salinity of the lake gets high enough, or more sensitive early stages in the life cycle of flies or shrimp are exposed to high salt concentrations, they outright die.
Dave's work focused increasingly on the abundant alkali fly. For the birds, the flies are a gourmet's feast.
It is the flies that are the filet mignon.
So that's the more juicy tidbits, huh?
That's the more juicy tidbits, not only in the sense of real juicy because they have higher water content, but also because they have much higher fat content. So not only are these a valuable food source to the birds that visit the lake, but it explains why the fly pupae were such an important food source to the Indians that used the lake. The Kutzadika, which was the fly pupa that was harvested by the Paiutes that lived here, is this very rich source of energy because of the high fat content. Well, you can live on it in the sense that if you're living in a cold climate where fat is a really important resource to maintain body heat, then something like a readily available and abundant source of fat that is present in the pupa stage of the flies is a valued food commodity.
What does it taste like? Is it?
Well, I'd say it's sort of a cross between peanuts with their shells on and beer nuts. It's
not too bad.
It's got a nutty flavor. Yeah, it's not too bad. I think we should try some while you're here.
Well, that sounds like something I really don't want to do.
From the water, and then
Soon I was sloshing through the lake with Dave. We were in a prime study area. The fly pupae in early stage of the life cycle were especially abundant.
Not very well known.
Walking on the soft lake bottom wasn't easy, but Dave was eager to show me something.
Yes, different brine shrimp. I guess you can't speak with me, is that it? But if we pull it out and
Dipping
turn it
his
over,
hands
you can
into
see
the
it's
briny
covered
water,
with pupae.
he picked up a rock covered
So
with
right
algae
here
and
along the
flies.
margins, you can see the algae can still grow because there's still
With the
sunlight
tweezers
there
that hung by a
exposed to it.
string around his neck,
So let's
he
pull
pulled off
couple
a single
and
fly
sample them.
pupa.
Because this, once again, is the Kutzadika.
Didn't
This is
even
the
look
food
like
source.
a fly.
There's a pupa. I've selected for you a juicy pupa, mature, with
Hey, thanks so much.
developing adult fly.
Is this an omega-3 oil? It's going to give me cholesterol.
This is-
I want to be real careful about that, okay?
This is real. This is even better than fish oil.
Oh, really?
So I'll pop one in at the same
Okay, you
time,
pop
just
it
to
in.
show you that people really do this.
Okay.
And then you chew it up a little bit between your front teeth.
All right.
It's got kind of a flavor of sort of a nutty, buttery flavor to me. What do you think?
Well,
That's
well,
okay.
it's a little it's salty is what it is.
Yeah,
Tastes a
well,
little salty.
that's pretty much the flavor of the lake water you're getting there.
Well, I like the flavoring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that.
You like it with salt.
It's actually not bad.
You like it with salt,
Yeah.
okay.
I don't love it, but it's not bad.
It makes a fine soup.
In a small way, we had entered into the intricate food web at the lake. Algae, flies, birds, it was all connected. In 1988, the snowpack was 30% of normal. The region entered a 6-year drought. Before the drought, the lake's volume had shrunk by half, and its salinity had doubled. Little progress was being made in court. David Gaines had left the helm of the committee to write. In January 1988, the Gaines family and committee worker Don Oberlin were driving north towards the lake. A vehicle traveling in the opposite direction tried to pass, but hit the Gaines car head on. David Gaines and Don Oberlin lost their lives.
The first reaction, of course, is deadening. I mean, it's just stunning. It's hard to grab hold of what that really means. David Gaines, I think, felt driven by an immense caring. I think David had a wonderful capacity to link the natural world to the human world and realize how important it was to both. And his humanity was such that he would not be able to let this go and just wash it off. And he would not be able to come out here just as a student to study it and then leave and take his science with him and say, ho-hum, That's the end of that. He could not do that. He wasn't that kind of a guy.
It's really, really important for people to have these places and not come up here and see an alkali wasteland. People need these kinds of places to celebrate our kinship with other life on this planet.
Even before the accident, the leadership of the committee had passed to others. The group, numbering 10,000 now, was headquartered near the lake in the town of Vining. 5 years had passed since the public trust decision, and Mono stream water still flowed to Los Angeles. The executive director of the committee was Martha Davis.
Obviously, it's been real successful.
An expert problem solver, she worked quietly behind the scenes. Part of her approach was to reduce LA's dependence on Mono water through reclamation and water conservation. Every ounce of her energy went towards finding a workable solution.
Take a look at what the Department of Water and Power has done. They said, LA has water rights, and they're ours. And if you think there's a problem at Mono Lake, well, that's either your problem or you're exaggerating, or... And so the process of the Department of Water and Power has been to deny the reality of the problem, deny the reality of a solution. They've pushed the solutions away.
I think the Mono Lake Committee has profited doom and destruction at times. I think they've reached for whatever piece of environmental concern might be helpful to their cause.
The department defended itself in court and conducted research at the lake. It funded study after study and pointed to the fact that even during the drought, the gulls were thriving.
The people that the Mono Lake Committee and the Audubon Society brought in, those who raised the issue in the first place, were predicting that the lake would crash, that there would be a disaster and all life would be obliterated. They talk in terms of terrible, terrible consequences. This has not happened.
We're not looking at a snapshot of what we've got today. We're thinking about it in terms of what we will have 10 years out from now, 20 years out from now. What we clearly have today is an impaired ecosystem. If the trends that we see continue, we may not have gulls here 20 and 30 years out.
In 1992, committee researcher John Kane skied out to measure the lake. He found it had fallen to its second lowest point in historical times. The lake was shrinking even though Judge Terrence Finney temporarily halted diversions. Toxic dust storms continued.
Back up here. Yeah, that's the block.
This alarming fall in lake level provided a rare opportunity to hike over the dry lake bed to Nedget Island. On a bitterly cold day, I started out with geologist Scott Stein.
We're going to be on a pumice surface all the way out toward Nedget Island there.
We would follow a route that had already been pioneered by coyotes searching for food. It wasn't surprising that the gulls abandoned Nedget in 1991.
Nedget Island right in front of us there is a composite volcano. It's composed of a whole bunch of different lava flows.
Nedget exploded into Mono's waters some 1,700 years ago and has erupted several times since.
Just the same time St. Helens put off, Long Valley right down here. You know,
We hiked across terraces left behind by the receding lake.
that was associated with the rising magma.
50
there.
years ago, we would have been hiking under 40 feet of water.
Was here in 1881 and 1882 and 1883, and right up here on that pinnacle.
Our steps touched the crusty lake bottom that gives rise to dust storms laden with arsenic.
Right at the water line in 1883, so we can go back to that.
Only a small channel of brackish water separated us from Nedget Island.
Smaller as the lake drops, and today it looks like we've got a little bridge here that we can use to cross it and go on to Nedget Island.
Okay, you want to go first?
Sure.
Good. You can show the way.
Show me the way.
Ah, you do so easy.
Well, life.
All right, I'm going to be Huck Finn here. See if I can
across the fjord. All right. The island itself looked almost impossible to walk on. Volcanic debris lay everywhere, but every foot that we ascended brought a new view into play. I've never seen such a If it was cold a while ago, it was even colder now. But my memory is not so much of cold as of space and light. As evening approached, we started back. I wanted Nedjed to be itself, be an island again. Hundreds of miles away, it was time for decisions. The courts had transferred the Mono Lake battle to the State Water Board. The board would finally determine the height at which Mono Lake would be maintained.
It's amazing to be in the same room with all the players who have participated in the last 15 years. Mono Lake has touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And today, finally, the government is opening its doors to listen to the people, to listen to the public voice.
People crowded into the public hearing.
Ladies and gentlemen, this hearing will come to order. My name is Mark Del Piero. I'm the Vice Chair of the State Water Resources.
Hundreds of speakers came to the podium.
Of the late David Gaines and the Mono Lake Committee, we are all well aware of the special qualities that Mono Lake offers our state.
People expressed their opinions on how high the lake should be kept. Many advocated raising the lake by at least 20 feet. The testimony required 30,000 pages of transcripts. Hearing officer Mark Del Piero presided over 46 days of general and scientific input. Some 4,000 letters flooded into Water Board headquarters.
Adverse impacts from the dewatering of the
With the final vote of the Water Board approaching, the committee organized public demonstrations. The 1994 bikeathon was one of the largest ever. Lake supporters gathered at the Water and Power Building to fill small tubes with water from the aqueduct. The tubes were then taped to the bicycles for the return to Mono Lake. A 300-mile journey lay ahead. The hearings went on, with the department advocating the status quo. Jim Wixer presented arguments for a lake level only several feet higher than the historical low point.
We have spent nearly $10 million to study over the last 14 years to develop the information necessary to make an informed decision.
But the department, for the first time in years, stood almost alone. Other agencies which might have defended it failed to do so. Even air quality became an issue.
Studies indicate that exceedances of the federal standard in the Mono Lake area are due to fugitive dust emissions. These emissions are primarily from the shores of Mono Lake, which have been exposed to the air by diversions of the water from the lake's tributaries.
The Water Board and its staff listened as the Air Resources Board squared off against the department.
We support maintaining the level of Mono Lake at 6,390 feet or higher.
The board found itself inundated by expert testimony as the hearings continued. For the cyclists on their way to the lake, the year of the final vote had special meaning.
People are starting in Los Angeles and they ride for 6 days and they're pedaling together up and over the hills and through the heat, and they have the sense of adventure and adversity and overcoming all these obstacles to reach this lake. It's symbolic, but it reaches very deep. I look at all those people and they are the heart and soul of the Mono Lake Committee. that moment comes when you're pouring the water back in, and it's an enormous affirmation of what we as human beings can do to make the world a better place.
Martha pointed out
The day of the water board vote arrived. In a press conference held beforehand, all parties announced their intention not to appeal the vote.
to help solve the problem.
It was a proud time for Martha Davis. Her work had helped launch new water reclamation efforts for a city of millions. She was able to generate wide support for Mono Lake while preventing people from becoming hopelessly at odds.
Retain its diversion structures in place and will be
The Water Board assembled September 28, 1994. The full board was in attendance, as well as many of the key players. The vote would be whether or not to mandate an elevation for Mono Lake 20 feet higher than its current level. This would drastically limit the water the department could take. Geologist Scott Stein came out of the wilderness to speak. Sitting in the back was Sally Gaines and her two children, Vireo and Sage, as well as Eldon Vestal and his wife.
Being here either as a county supervisor,
Representing the people of Mono was Andrea Lawrence. The audience listened as the podium was taken by Eldon Vestal, who must have been the oldest advocate of the lake present.
I have waited more than 50 years for this moment. Never in my wildest dreams did I think my work in the Mono Basin would be of value more than a half a century hence. One reason I kept feeling...
We will now move to the important matter at hand today. Is there a motion? Mr. Chairman. It is moved by Mr. Del Piero. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, I second.
It is seconded by Mr. Brown. All right, it's been moved and seconded. Ms. Marche, please call the roll.
Mr. Del Piero?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Ms. Forrester? Mr. Stubchair? Mr. Caffrey?
Aye. The order is unanimously adopted.
Mr. Chairman, the board should be very proud of what it's done. Today, my friends, we've done the right thing. Today, we saved Mono Lake.
After working on this for so many years, it's kind of like it's hard to believe that it's finally come true, but it's happened.
But I think it speaks well for democracy. When this case began, it was a small group of citizens who thought something was wrong and they were arrayed against powerful interests. Today we had unanimity.
In the midst of 100 congratulations, David Gaines was not forgotten.
His spirit today is filling the room and is very content and satisfied with what's going on today. Very pleased, very proud also.
He would probably want to play music for a couple of days. He would probably want to just go down to the lake and play his mandolin for days and days.
The news of the Water Board decision would spread far beyond Mono Lake and across the nation.
This is a country that in many areas, as in environmental protection, can come to the brink of disaster, but has the institutions and the wherewithal to stop before it falls over the edge. And I think the reason for that is because we have empowered ordinary people to have a role in the legal system.
After the Water Board vote, the streams were full. Runoff reached a 12-year maximum. The water ran freely down the mountains with none of it being tapped for use elsewhere. Within 2 years of the vote, the streams had poured enough water into the lake to raise it over 5 feet. But it will take years to achieve the level mandated by the vote. As quickly as the lake is rising, it still has far to go. The Mono Lake story is framed by 16, perhaps 20 years, a mere second in its million-year history. And yet 16 years of people expending time, thought, and devotion beyond measure. It will be a story told again and again, a story that may well expand to mythic proportions as the years go by. It will be said, nature willing, we saved Mono Lake.
Major funding for the battle for Mono Lake has been provided by the Michael J. Connell Foundation, the California Council for the Humanities, the Mono Lake Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional support has been received from these organizations.